Hey there and welcome to the Mastering Script Lettering course. My name is Scott Biersack. I am a freelance illustrator and designer with a large focus in type design and lettering. So here's a couple of designs that I've done in the past. Some packaging design for an apple cider company, skateboard designs for girl skateboards, a chalk mural, whiskey packaging, a drop cap for the type fight, a letterpress print, and lastly some more whiskey packaging. So throughout this course we're going to cover every bit of information regarding script lettering, from proper letterform construction to weight distribution, speeds, angles, flourishing, and even vectoring. So at the end of this course we're going to have two finished pieces of lettering, one very formal piece of script lettering and one very informal piece of script lettering. Now if this is your first time drawing letterforms, don't worry if they don't turn out the way you expect them to, because this takes lots of time and practice. Lots and lots of time and practice. But this course is going to be perfect for anyone looking to get started within the lettering world, as well as those looking to perfect their already existing knowledge. So if you're ready to draw some letters, let's get started. Alright, so before we get too much further into this tutorial, let's talk about the supplies we're going to need. All you need is any type of pencil that you prefer. I just have this standard mechanical pencil, as well as an eraser, a roll of tracing paper, or a pad of tracing paper. As long as it's tracing paper, that's all that matters. And then the last thing you're going to need is the downloadable content that you can download and print off for this course. You're going to have a total of 6 pages altogether that we're going to utilize within this class. The first is our guide page, which we will be using for the formal script lettering, as well as our lowercase stems, our flourishes, the uppercase strokes, and lastly, some formal script examples. This is the Edwardian script by Linotype and Bickham Script Pro by Adobe. We'll be utilizing all those throughout the course, so make sure you have all those printed out. So let's discuss a little history before we begin drawing. So script lettering is essentially any type of letter form that connects to another by an exit and an entry stroke. So here are a couple examples of informal script lettering that I've recently done. I tend to draw more informal styles because of the variety and the energy that I can integrate into each piece. But time to dive into a bit more history so you can understand the origins. So the formal script letter forms that we will focus on were extremely popular around the 17th and 18th century within European countries. The overall letter form structure was created by utilizing a flat nib or a pointed nib pen, and this means that the letters were calligraphed or written in 1 or 2 strokes of the pen rather than drawn and built up over time like we'll be using with a pencil. But scripts such as the round hand or Spencerian and copperplate are all considered formal scripts because of the construction and the methods to the form of the letters. All of them were written with a pointed nib and ink. These letter forms generally have a specific slope and an angle around 50 plus degrees, like 52, 53. It varies between penmen and in the speed that you want to write at. But if you're wondering where you can see those examples, maybe like the Declaration of Independence, that was written in like a copperplate style script, or even the Coca-Cola logo contains some sort of characteristics of Spencerian script. But on the other hand, we have informal script, which is much more flexible. It has some roots within formal script, such as letterform construction, but it has the ability to be completely unique from its origin, such as like the overall speed, composition, color, size, and other factors vary within informal script. Altering the width and the angle, the size, the contrast, other characteristics of a letter form, that can create unique informal script letter forms, and you can essentially create almost anything you can think of. You'll truly grasp the difference between both the forms as we progress through the course. So I'll see you in chapter 2, where we begin to draw the formal script lettering. Okay, so now we're ready to begin the formal script lettering. In this chapter, we're going to be breaking things down into essentially 5 separate shapes. Each of these shapes will comprise every single letter form within our alphabet. So we have our diagonal stem, almost like a lowercase L stroke, the second half to an N, as well as the J stroke, which is essentially just a J without the dot on the I, and then lastly we have an oval. So these 5 shapes will be utilized. For example, if you wanted to create the letter A, you would combine an oval with half of an L stroke. Or if you wanted to create the letter H, for example, you would use one diagonal stem and one N stroke. So you can really break things down within our alphabet and really understand which shapes are creating which letter form. All right, so now that you understand which shapes make up each letter form, we're going to actually begin drawing these forms. And what I think might be best is to pick a word that utilizes all of these 5 shapes, as well as possibly the letter S or the letter Z, because the S and the Z are very unique characters, and they are almost the oddballs out. They are drawn a bit differently and require a little bit of a different process to develop without using these 5 separate shapes. So think of a word, maybe it's like the word design, typography, flourish, any word that utilizes these 5 shapes as well as an S or a Z, because that way you'll gain the understanding of how these letter forms are developed. So pick a word and we will utilize that word throughout the rest of this chapter. All right, so now we're going to essentially understand our slope of our formal script letters. On this guide page, you can see I included some diagonal lines throughout the page, which gives you an understanding of how the letter forms need to follow this consistent angle across our word. So with our strokes in front of us, as well as our example letter forms to just reference while we're drawing, keep those in front. And we are going to place a piece of tracing paper on top of our guide page. That way the guide page stays free and clear of all of our pencil marks. And in case you don't understand what's on this guide page, the top line is our ascender, which is essentially the top of your B, your D, H, K, etc. And then this dotted line is the X height, so that is where the top of your lowercase letter form will sit. For example, if you're drawing a letter A, the A will touch the X height and then touch what we have is the baseline down below. And then lastly, we have our descender. So the strokes that follow down, such as the P or the Q, Y, Z, etc., those will reach down to the descender line. So now with our tracing paper on top, we're going to begin drawing our word. In this case, I'm going to draw the word design. We will begin combining an oval shaped and a L stroke. So let's begin doing that while following this diagonal 52-degree line that we have going on. We'll just draw our oval. Keep it nice and light, and then once you get it to a good spot, add in your weight. It's okay to keep it rough because we will just continuously edit this throughout the chapter until we essentially reach perfection. Next, we'll draw the L stroke. And one thing to keep in mind with our formal letter forms is that every curve, such as this counterform in here, or this loop at the end of the L stroke, everything needs to be very circular. So as if you could fit an entire circle within our curves. So we'll fill that in. Next we'll draw the E, another oval. Make sure you follow that axis. See how that line cuts straight through. And then we'll add in our weight. And then just erase this part of the E so that counter opens up. And next we have our S, the rather difficult letter form. But it's pretty simple if you break things down. Let me draw it real quick and I'll explain it in just a bit. All right, so with this S, you have to pay attention to where the weight is distributed. With the top of this knot of the S, essentially, that is going to exceed the X height, because if it were to touch the X height along with the E and the D, it would almost appear as if it was lower. So to compensate for that, we have to extend it above the X height and then bring our weight down towards the bottom. Make sure you have another very circular counterform. And we're going to connect that to an I. When you're drawing all of these letter forms, you want to make sure the weights are consistent throughout each letter form. So as you can see, our I almost appears a bit bolder than the rest. So to fix that, I might either add weight to everything else or reduce the weight on the I. But like I said, we're going to be editing this throughout the course. So we will throw a piece of tracing paper on top and then correct it later. So let's not worry about it. We're just going to get the structure of it down first. Because the beautiful thing about lettering is it's all editable, and we will be going back and forth with our eraser, adding in weight, removing weight, and we'll just continue to do that throughout. So next we'll have our G, another oval. Add in the tittle, the dot of the I called the tittle. All right, add in our J stroke. All right, and then lastly, we're going to finish off with our N. We're going to have half of a diagonal stem, and then we will add on the end stroke. Making sure we are following that diagonal axis, the 52 degrees. It doesn't necessarily need to be 52 degrees as long as everything is consistent. I think that is all that matters, really. So it's not looking too bad. All right, so with your word completed, what you want to do now is refine this until you correct your letter spacing, make sure your weights are distributed evenly, make sure everything looks essentially even and consistent throughout the entire word. And you can see what I did. Essentially throw a piece of tracing paper on top of that and draw on top of the word. And this is where I ended up. I corrected all the spacing, the weights. There's still some minor issues. I think I could add in a bit more weight into this G. But essentially what you're doing is just throwing on another piece of paper, correcting it until it's perfected, until you reach that stage where you say, okay, this is done. All right, so within this chapter, we're going to be discussing the connecting points within our letter forms. One of the characteristics of formal script lettering is how everything is very consistent. Everything flows very nicely. Everything looks very elegant and beautiful, and that is because of the connecting points as well as the thick to thin ratio with our stroke contrast. So let's discuss our smooth connections between each letter form as well as our kerning and tracking of the word, as well as maybe even leading too if we get to that point. So with our letter forms, you can see how each letter has this consistent circular upstroke. You can fit a circle within each of these upstrokes, right? So everything has this upward connecting point, and all of our exit strokes enter into the next letter very, very high into the letter form. A general mistake is a lot of people will change this angle. If this angle changes, that is okay. Like, for example, like the S, it is slightly altered to create space around the letter form. But if the exit stroke, for example, goes straight across like this, instead of keeping that consistent circular exit stroke, some of the letter forms might appear to like stab into another letter form. If we had, for example, a letter B or something, it would look as if it's stabbing into it rather than flowing into it like we have with the D and the E, etc. So definitely pay attention to our connecting points of each letter form. You want to just make sure they connect fairly high to keep that consistency. And then when it comes to spacing is a rather difficult thing as well. But you need to be spacing as you're drawing. You need to just be aware of what letter is before the letter you're drawing and what letter is coming after the letter you're drawing. So that'll allow you to understand how much space to put between each letter form. For example, I think there's a bit too much space between this S and the I. So when I throw a piece of tracing paper on top, I would essentially nudge the I, the G, and the N over just a hair to close up this space right here. All right, so now that you have an understanding of our connections as well as spacing and the basic understanding of each of these strokes, let's discuss how the weight is distributed throughout all these letter forms. With general calligraphy, you're using a pointed nib pen, right? And you're going to be taking that pen and dipping it into a canister of ink, essentially. And when you pull your pen across and apply pressure as you're pulling it down, more ink is being released from that pen to create this thick stroke here, right? And then you come across and come back up, and when you're pulling it up, you're not applying pressure, so therefore no ink is being released to create a thicker stroke there. So same thing goes with the next stroke. You're pulling it down, which creates the thicker stroke, and then you're pulling it back up, which creates the thinner stroke. And that is the same throughout all of our letter forms. When you're pulling a letter form down from top to bottom, right, the ink is being released. So that sort of idea is being distributed across all of our letter forms. So when you're drawing your letter forms, it's easy to understand where those thick to thin ratios occur, because you just need to understand how the pen would generally react when you're drawing those forms. One thing to be aware of as well is when you're drawing a horizontal stroke like the F or the T, you're pulling it across, right? You're doing something similar as pulling it up, where the pen is not releasing any ink. it is just a hairline thicker because you are going horizontal. But other than that, you can see how it is just ever so slightly, just a tad thicker than when you are pulling the pen upwards. So one common mistake I see is when for example, if you're drawing a T and it looks exactly like the one we have up here, right? You have your thin stroke there. Some people tend to cross a thick stroke with a thick stroke. And you don't want to do something like this because then it creates a large amount of positive space, and it becomes an eyesore if you're drawing an entire word, for example. And let's say I cross a thick stroke here with this G, right? These two thicks crossing creates a very heavy space down in this word, and it just disrupts the readability of the word, in my opinion. So just pay attention to these little things and always think back to, okay, what would the pointed pen be doing, or what would the flat nib pen be doing if you were using a flat nib as well. So now that you guys have an understanding of the thick to thin relationship, we can discuss flourishing. Now you can see a good amount of flourishing within the capital letter forms that we have here. Each letter form has its own sort of unique flourish going on, but we can break those down as well into just about 4 separate flourishes. We have a spiral shape, which could be customized any way you wanted to. For example, you can see the spiral shape within this B, but it still doesn't look exactly like this spiral, right? So it can be customized. The next shape we have is a loop, and then we have a swelled line for a horizontal-like stroke, like the L or the F. And then lastly, we have a tail. And the tail could be customized as well, maybe something similar to this H or the other stroke of the H as well. All right, so with our piece of tracing paper, let's begin drawing some of these flourishes. And you can see it's exactly like our thick to thin relationship within our lowercase and capital letter forms. You're going to be pulling this down to create the thicker stroke, pulling it across to create a thin stroke. This could be thin or thick. It depends on the letter you're trying to draw or where this sits on the composition. It's all up to you and your eye. And then, of course, similar, going across is going to be thin, pulling it down. It's that same sort of relationship, right? So I would begin by practicing drawing some of these forms. You could even utilize the previous drawings that we've done with your word. And for example, like if you wanted this N to exit with a flourish, let's go ahead and try that. So instead of exiting with just a regular old exit stroke, maybe it comes down like so, and it has some sort of tail-like flourish, right? And then you would add in your thick stroke here, similar to what we have going on here. This would be thin. And this could end in any sort of maybe it's a teardrop terminal or a ball terminal. You could draw a circle at the end. Any sort of ending that you'd like. It's up to you. But the key to flourishing is to make sure everything's very smooth, everything's very elegant and not so forced. I've seen a lot of forced looking flourishes. For example, if you drew, let's have like a T, an H, an E. Sometimes people just like to flourish everything, connect everything, and then bring this around, and it's almost too much flourishing, right? You want to balance the composition with flourishing. Flourishing should be a secondary thing. It should also add to the piece. It shouldn't take away from the piece, if that makes sense. right? So you want to be able to, for example, in the word design, just this one single flourish, I think, adds to the design. It doesn't take away from the entire design. So you want to be very nitpicky almost with the flourishing that you're doing, and you don't want to overkill it. You want to be very sparse with your flourishing. So go ahead and begin drawing some of these basic flourish shapes. Gain an understanding of how they are drawn. Make sure you keep that consistent, smooth line along, and everything feels as if it was drawn by the same hand, because you want your flourishing and your letter forms to look the same, as well as flow from the letter forms in the same similar graceful manner. So go ahead and practice that, and we will get into the next chapter. All right, so one thing I want to mention is we did focus on a lot of the lowercase forms, while we didn't really tackle some of the uppercase forms. And I think that's perfectly okay, because you have the understanding of what sort of shapes and strokes make up each of these letter forms. So very similar to the uppercase, everything is comprised of these 6 basic strokes. We have a diagonal one with a swelled thick to thin ratio, a very thin line, which you can see in like the letter A, for example, or even the letter N, with a teardrop or a ball terminal, another swelled stroke, another almost L-shaped stroke that's swelled as well, thin to thick ratios, and then another larger oval shape, and then just a basic diagonal line. So you can use these 6 shapes and strokes to create the entire uppercase alphabet. And you can understand just how all of these forms are drawn, and then compare and contrast how the Bickham script looks compared to the Edwardian script, how each letter form is a fairly similar structure, but slightly different in terms of like the stroke endings, like the swelled stroke on this H, or even the composition of the Z is completely different. So just compare and contrast, see what those look like, and then just begin drawing those as well and see what your forms look like. So as long as all your uppercase forms look exactly like these 6 basic strokes and shapes, I think you're good to go. Just go ahead and practice, and good luck. So now with your basic understanding of formal script lettering, let's begin the vectoring process of these letter forms. Now, if you have no idea how to properly vector your letter forms, I think it might be best to start on paper for your brain to truly understand where to place these anchor points. So if you utilize your existing word, let's place a piece of tracing paper on top. And the key to vectoring is you want to plot your points on the extrema of the letter forms, which is essentially the north and south, west and east most points of the form. So if we were to draw a square around our letter form, right? So let's draw a square around the letter E. So each letter form is going to be a bit different, right? So whichever point or wherever the letter form is touching that square, that is essentially the extrema of the letter form. So we know that we're going to need a point here, here, down in the corner, and then at the base, right? So these handles will extend, and then these handles will extend vertically. These will extend horizontally. Another key point is handles need to distribute the weight evenly. So if we were to, draw a circle, you want all of your handles to be essentially equal. You don't want one of your handles to be this long and another one to be this short, right? You don't, because then the weight isn't distributed evenly. One of the handles would be doing more work. It's probably a little difficult to understand this on paper, but if this makes it easier for you, go ahead and just continue drawing squares around your letter forms, because that will give you the basic idea of where to start drawing your anchor points, because getting the extrema of the letter form is probably the hardest part And then you might need to go back in and add in additional points if need be. It takes a lot of time and practice to understand where to place them. But once you get the extrema down, I think the rest is pretty straightforward. We will get into the computer stage of the vectoring later in the tutorial, but I just wanted to show you the basic understanding of the extrema of each of these letter forms. Go ahead and continue drawing squares if you need to, but until then, we will get on the computer and begin vectoring within Adobe Illustrator later in the course. So welcome to Chapter 3. We are going to finally tackle informal script lettering, which is probably my favorite because of the variety of styles you can achieve through the editing process. So with informal script, it's very relatable to handwriting, and a lot of the pieces I have completed have been derivative of my handwriting, somebody else's handwriting, something I've come across in my internet travels, or even keeping receipts from restaurants. I have a collection of receipts from restaurants when waiters might write, thank you to you, and just truly understanding that each letter form is completely different in its own unique character. So referencing some of those things is vital to drawing informal style script, because it's not so structured like formal script is, right? So everything can vary within the composition, like the angle or the size or the weights. Things can change, but you need to also balance those things. You need to make sure everything still is somewhat consistent across your entire word or phrase or whatever you may be drawing. So within this first chapter, we are going to start with a phrase or word again, something that you want to draw. In this case, I'm going to be drawing the title of this course, Mastering the Art of Script Lettering. I added in the art because I wanted to have a bit longer of a phrase to draw. So we're going to be starting off with our handwriting, right? So we'll get a piece of tracing paper, and utilizing your handwriting is probably the best way to start with informal script, because you can use the already existing forms that you create with your own hand, and depending on how you write those forms, if you write them very fast, for example, if you write fast, really fast, this S might have like a weird structure to it, or the exit stroke of this crossbar just like extrudes out really quickly. So for me, I'm going to be drawing mastering script lettering. So I am going to write script lettering really quickly, or just start really tiny, because for some reason when you write really small, the forms, your letter forms just like turn out better almost. Because if you're drawing rather large, your hand is like, you have to almost think about where your hand is going, right? But when you're drawing really small, your hand is in this tiny space, and you can draw the entire phrase really quickly, get some crazy letter form structures going on, maybe even add in some stuff like that G. Just continuously draw it over and over and over and over until you like reach this stage of like, okay, this looks good, right? So you kind of will just know like, oh, this S is awesome. Maybe I like how this T connects to the I. Things like that. When you're drawing it over and over, you come across these crazy unique ways to draw a letter form how you like normally wouldn't draw that form, right? So drawing it over and over, just continuously do that and like fill the entire page. And now I've already done this, so I'll show you what I did before. I drew it over and over and over, and rather big, rather large, some fast, some not so fast. Because when you're drawing fast, you're almost creating that angle that we discussed within the formal script lettering, right? You want to have that consistency too. So I found out that this squared off piece probably was the best because everything fit in so nicely, how these T's fit in underneath the R, and the P curled in, you know, the G just covered the negative space along the bottom. The S had this strange entry stroke, and then it twisted up and into the rest of the letter form. So after you're done drawing over and over and over, I would select one of those that you think is the best. And then we're going to continuously edit that one piece over and over throughout this course as well. So select which one you think is best, and we'll move on from there. All right, so with your selected piece of lettering, we're going to scan that one piece into the computer, and I would just blow it up really, really big on 8.5 by 11, which is what I did here. I even added in Mastering the Art of Script Lettering at the top. And so this is that exact piece of lettering, although it's just scaled up. Don't worry about like the roughness of it, because from now on we can really fine-tune what these letters look like by putting on another piece of tracing paper and just drawing it over and over until we perfect it, essentially. I want to discuss varying angles and rhythms. Within informal script lettering, you can change the angles and the rhythm of your phrase. For example, you can see how the C sits a bit higher than the R, and the I sits a bit higher as well. The P jumps down, the T is up. So it has like this sort of almost undulating, like it's got like this crazy up and down bass line. That's the sort of thing you can get away with script lettering, as long as everything is consistent. Because if you drew the word script, for example, like this, like that I, for example, just looks really almost out of place, right? Because it doesn't have anything else that it's balanced with. Everything is very upwards along here, and then everything's very lower along the second half of the word. So you want to just make sure that there's a balance between everything. Everything is still consistent, like the stroke weights and the slope of the letter form, but sometimes the slope of the letter form can change as well. As long as you balance that, everything will look a little bit more normal if it's balanced with the rest of the letter forms. For example, if you drew the word script again, but like let's say the S has got an angle like this, maybe the C has an angle like that, that would mean your R needs to be very similar to the S, right? It needs to have this sort of balance to it. Everything needs to either go back and forth, or, you know, it depends on the word, depends on the structure. A lot of things will vary between informal and formal. But the main thing to take away is if you are doing something crazy like that, you just need to make sure that you balance it with the other letter forms. But the one great thing about this crazy bass line is everything has like this nice rhythm, this nice flow to it. It's not just a very structured, straight bass line, right? Everything, it almost appears more energetic, more vibrant. It just has a bit more energy to it when it has this flow to it. So that's the beauty of informal, is like things can be a little bit crazy, and that's what makes it so unique. So within this part of the chapter, again, scan in your handwriting, blow it up, and we will begin fine-tuning it with a piece of tracing paper throughout this course. All right, so you can see that I have placed a piece of tracing paper on top of my printout and have traced over the already existing forms to essentially fine-tune everything, truly understand like where everything is sitting, the composition, what these letter forms will look like. And right now it's looking pretty good, but one thing I want to discuss before we continue to further edit this is we have, with informal lettering, we have a stabbing connection. With formal lettering, everything's very graceful, everything's very fluid. But with informal, you can get away with a stabbing connection, I think. And for example, you can see in the E, we discussed it earlier, but you can see how this E just almost stabs into the side of the T, or even the T somewhat stabs into the other T. With informal lettering, you can get away with these sort of stabbing connections because it doesn't need to be so formal like our formal script lettering. So it is very okay to do something such as this, but for me personally, there's something about stabbing connections that I just don't like within my lettering, so I'm going to try and fine-tune this and bring in more of that smooth connecting point. So when you're drawing and going through this editing process, don't worry if your letter forms are stabbing into others, similar to like this N to the G as well. So continue to fine-tune this, continue to, throw another piece of tracing paper on top and draw and draw and draw until you essentially perfect this, similar to how we perfected our formal script. All right, so now you can see through this editing process that I made things a bit thicker. You can see how it started pretty thin, and then I thickened everything up. And one trick to do that, and I will show you, is to get a piece of tracing paper. So get a piece of tracing paper, and we're going to draw the left-hand side of our letter form, right? So if we drew the left-hand side of this S, and then we nudged it over, you can see where that S was before, and then you can connect those two. So finishing that off, you'd follow that through, right? And then continue to move it over. Get that sort of loop going on. And then you would continue to do that throughout the rest of your letter form. So draw the left-hand side of the C, nudge it over. Oh, we forgot to do this. And this side, nudge it over, and then now you have the thick side of your C, and then you can connect the rest of everything else too. So hopefully that makes sense. You just draw the left-hand side of your letter form, or the right-hand side, and you can nudge it to the right, whatever direction you'd want to go in, and then finish connecting that off. So through that editing process, I essentially reached this stage, this very thickened up version of the script lettering. You can see how much progress we've made just from our initial handwriting to where we are now. And there's still so much room for improvement, but it's cool to see that our handwriting can end up into something completely unique and completely different from what we started with. But more importantly, within this chapter, I want to discuss a little bit more about drawing various forms of letters. With script lettering, there's so many ways that you can draw a letter form. I mean, even with sans serif and regular serif letter forms, there's so many ways to draw those as well, right? So for example, if you were to draw the letter R, in this case I have a very cursive-like R, but you could also have something similar to a brush script sort of R that looks something like this, right? I'm sure you've seen something similar along these lines. This is a very brush-like letter form, but I think it would still fit in with the rest of the forms that I have going on. Another thing is like with an F. If you wanted to, you could draw a cursive F that has some sort of, a thicker stroke. It curls into itself. And then maybe the top end curls into itself as well. Maybe you have like a wavy horizontal crossbar. Or you could have an F that was just very, very up and down. And then it has just a round terminal, a swash terminal, something like that. What I'm trying to get across is there's so many ways to draw these letter forms, so don't feel like you're stuck in drawing an E like this. Maybe it's a capital E, the one that almost looks like a backwards 3, right? It could be something like that. Like, don't feel like you're stuck into drawing one sort of form. You have the ability, this is lettering after all, so you have the ability to do just about anything that you want, really. So throughout this editing process, keep that in mind so that way your lettering can almost look even more unique and more custom than what you're normally drawn to drawing throughout your process. All right, so now you can see we started with our initial handwriting, blew that up onto the computer, scanned that rather large, printed it out, continued to refine it with another piece of tracing paper on top, and then continued to refine that over and over and over, added in some weight, the top of the phrase, mastering the art of, continued to make edits again and again. I was trying to fix the descender of this G, for example, and then, you know, kept going, and I kept pushing until we finally reached this final stage of what we have now, which says the mastering the art of script lettering. All right, so one thing with this is that a lot of the weight is in the bottom half of the letter form, which you can see throughout all of these forms going on throughout the phrase. With our formal and informal script, you can get away with things like this as long as things are consistent and balanced throughout the entire composition. For example, I even added in that bell-bottom sort of weight distribution across the word mastering. And then to keep things a little bit more simplified, I added in the art of in a very brush-like sans serif sort of letter form style, just so it wouldn't compete with everything. One thing to be aware of when you're doing a larger phrase such as this, you need to figure out, okay, what is like the most important thing I want to say? So in this case, I think script lettering is, and then the next most important is the mastering word. And then lastly, the art of, I think is the least important thing, which is why I kept that rather small. So now that everything is all finished off, everything's pretty polished with our pencil drawing, let's go ahead and scan this into the computer, and we will then begin to start the vectoring stage of this piece of lettering in Adobe Illustrator. All right, so let's begin vectoring out the informal script that we developed within the course. The first thing you're going to do is scan it into the computer, open it up into Photoshop, and the rest of this video is going to be a sped up time lapse of that whole process that I went from sketch to the final vector. So I will play this time lapse and I will describe the process of everything that's going on as time goes on. So let's get to it. So first thing you're going to do is open up a Photoshop document, play with the levels and the contrast to essentially see your lettering more clearly. Bring it into Illustrator and knock that back to like a dull 10% opacity so you can trace on top of it. And then here we are going through and just placing those vector points. Like I mentioned in a previous video, you're going to place those anchor points on the extremum, essentially the north and south, east and west most points of your letters. Each of them is going to be vectored out separately. So as you can see with this S, I'm finessing those points. You want to use as few as possible to get those smooth curves. And you want to distribute that weight evenly with all those Bezier handles. So again, just like finessing those points until I move on to the next letter form. Here we go into the C. You're going to want to vector out each of these letter forms separately into separate shapes. So that way, when it comes time, you can move those letter forms around if need be. Again, you can see in the crotch of the R that I applied a crossover technique, essentially having the anchor points extend into the letter form, and then you can navigate outward from that anchor point to get that sharp corner in the crotch of the R. And I do that throughout a couple of the other letter forms throughout this process. You know, this is just a very back and forth process using the pen tool. It's never an easy process. It's always trial and error. So it's going to take some time to get used to this sort of thing if this is your first time doing it. There's definitely no easy way of vectoring your letterforms. Obviously, you could use the auto trace feature, but ultimately your letterforms really aren't going to look the best, especially if you're developing something such as a logo type that really needs to be perfected in terms of like your color and your weight and all sorts of aspects of a logo type. So I guess it just depends on what the end goal is, but using that pen tool is, you know, it's going to be your best friend throughout all your vectoring projects. So throughout this process, you can see, especially in this G, I utilize some shapes as well. With something like the G, it just makes sense to use the shape tool and create a circle, and then alter those forms to fit your letter forms. Once everything is all outlined and vectored out, in this process that you're seeing here, I'm still correcting those anchor points and the placements, because you can see after everything is filled in with a solid color, you'll see all those minor inconsistencies in your letter forms. So I'm going back through and correcting a lot of those things, you know, smoothing out the curves, fixing everything that I think needs more weight or less weight, or, you know, maybe we need to kern some letter forms. And that's the great thing about vectoring is you can move these letter forms pretty easily without having to, you know, draw and redraw using a piece of paper. So this is just a very straightforward process. And then here we go at the end. I changed the color so you can see that it is now a finished piece. There's still some minor things that I might go ahead and change, but you know, through that whole entire process, it definitely took me about, you know, an hour and a half or 2 hours just to vector out those 2 words. So to vector out the rest of them, it's the same sort of process, you know, drawing the outline, filling it in with a solid color, and then going back and forth and finessing those handles until perfection. So if you have any questions regarding anchor point placement or, you know, anything at all related to vectoring, feel free to reach out and I will get back to you. One more video. I just wanted to show you guys a list of helpful resources and materials for you to check out to further your knowledge of script lettering and just lettering in general. The first one I highly recommend is The Art of Hand Lettering by Helm Watzkow. It's a wonderful book that has all sorts of lettering within not just script lettering, but you know, the basics of serif, sans serif, any type of lettering you're trying to get your hands onto. The next one's Mastering Layout by Mike Stevens. Layout is very important when it comes to lettering. You need to understand the composition and what's working, what isn't, you know, hierarchy, that sort of thing. So I highly recommend that as well. The next one is going to be Scripts. It's literally just called Scripts, and it's by Louise Feely and Stephen Heller. That has a wonderful slew of great resources of like scripts within other countries. It's just a great inspiration sort of source. The next one's going to be Script Lettering for Artists by Tommy Tompkins. A lot of the information that I know to this day is from this book, as well as taking workshops within the Cooper Union. Go to coopertype.org. Everything they offer through their workshops, like workshops from Ken Barber and John Downer, and many other great teachers that go and teach through the New York location, as well as now they have a San Francisco location. So if you are in the United States, I highly recommend checking those out. If you have any other questions as for other resources or any other sources of inspiration or anything else for that matter, feel free to let me know. But this is a great start. So check out these and you will not be disappointed. All right, so we made it. This concludes the end of the course. Thank you so much for signing up for this script lettering course with me. We covered just about everything from start to finish. But there's still so much work left to do, and that is the hours and hours of practice. Because the only way you'll improve your letter forms is if you draw them over and over and over again until your brain really understands the proper letter form construction, weight distribution, and all those things we discussed within the class. because over time you'll just get the hang of it all. But anyway, thanks again for signing up for the course. If you have any questions at all, feel free to contact me. So good luck.